Saving Private Ryan is a film that sits at the intersection of history, myth, and cinematic invention. Before we judge it on technical grounds, we must ask, which real events and personal stories did the film borrow from, and what was its purpose in borrowing them? This first section examines the primary historical inspirations for the movie, evaluates the real cases that resemble its plot, and shows how Spielberg and his writers turned fragments of fact into a dramatic narrative. This is not about whether the film is true in every detail. It's about mapping the scaffolding of reality that supports the drama. At the core of the film's premise is the rescue of a single man, a private, because he is the last surviving brother of several killed in action. The narrative hook stems from actual U.S. military policies and several high-profile real-life cases from World War II. Beginning with the policy, in 1944, the U.S. War Department implemented a set of rules informing the return of family members from combat if multiple members of that family had been killed. Popularly summarized as the sole survivor policy, it wasn't a single neat law, but a combination of criteria and administrative directives intended to prevent tragic repetition in families and to manage morale and public perception. The War Department's directive allowed, under certain circumstances, for members of a family to be returned to the U.S. to avoid further loss. That policy forms the ethical and bureaucratic backbone of the film's mission, the idea that the Army would expend resources to bring one soldier home to spare a grieving mother further loss. Real cases that resemble Private Ryan's story are instructive. The most frequently cited is the story of the Nyland brothers from Tonawanda, New York. In 1944, the four Nyland brothers, Edward, Preston, Robert, Bob, and Frederick, served in the U.S. forces. By mid-1944, events had reduced the family to a single known survivor, Robert Bob Nyland. One brother, Edward, was killed on D-Day. Frederick, was reported missing, but later believed to have been captured by the Japanese in Burma. He eventually turned out to be alive. Preston survived. The War Department, upon belief that three of the brothers were dead, ordered Robert back to the U.S. to save him from further potential loss. This case parallels Saving Private Ryan's premise closely and is widely acknowledged as a primary historical antecedent, but it's worth emphasizing the differences. The actual administrative procedure was less cinematic, involved uncertainties, and the outcomes for the Nyland family were more complex than a single neat rescue. The Nyland case shows how the military's policies translated into real human consequences, but it does not provide a single blueprint for the film's action scenes or squad-level drama. Another real story often mentioned is that of the Borgstrom family. Arthur Borgstrom was killed in action, and at least one brother later died as well, prompting the family to be designated under policies for separation and return. There were numerous cases in which families lost multiple sons, and in a handful of instances, the military eased the burden by returning remaining sons to the U.S. These are administrative facts that create the moral rationale for a rescue mission in fiction, but they do not explain the movie's particular choice to stage an 8-man squad sent deep into enemy territory to retrieve one man. So why did the filmmakers choose this particular conceit, a small squad behind lines, rather than a bureaucratic transfer back home? The answer lies in storytelling needs. Cinema requires a confined perspective, a human-scale narrative through which the audience can experience large events. A single squad gives the viewer someone to root for, a point of identification in the chaos. Historically, rescue or administrative return orders weren't executed by ad hoc combat patrols. They were processed through headquarters, personnel offices, and transport units. But a squad-level mission allows the film to explore themes of duty, sacrifice, and the personal cost of war on a micro level. This is creative license anchored by a historical administrative reality, the policy that the Army would, under some conditions, spare remaining family members from combat. Another layer of historical inspiration is the film's depiction of the invasion of Normandy itself. Spielberg and his cinematographer Janos Kaminski
sought to recreate the sensory experience of D-Day, the smell of cordite, the numbing shock of explosions, the visual chaos of bodies and debris, based on first-hand soldier accounts, archival footage, and honorary consultants who had been there. The opening sequence, which follows Captain Miller's men as they assault Omaha Beach, intentionally channels the documentary footage of the actual landings, most famously the raw film shot by U.S. Army and naval cameramen that shows disoriented, waiting troops and an entangled shoreline of equipment, casualties, and smoke. That archival aesthetic is not simply a stylistic choice. It is an attempt to approximate evangelical realism, to make the viewer feel the randomness and brutality that many D-Day veterans described. The film's production team interviewed dozens of veterans, read memoirs, and consulted historians and military advisors to shape not just what soldiers did, but how they experienced combat. But while the film borrows details from real accounts, it also synthesizes them. Many of the specific vignettes in the film, a machine gun nest pinned to a cliff, a landing craft swamped by crossfire, an enemy sniper hidden in a ruined church steeple, are composites drawn from various reports and engagements in Normandy and other European theaters. For instance, the film's focus on the hedgerow country and intense small unit fighting mimics the combat that followed the beaches in the weeks after D-Day, particularly in the bocage of Normandy, where the terrain favored defenders and resulted in bloody infantry engagements. The film conflates a compressed timeline and geographical spread of incidents into a single condensed mission. That compression is a common practice in historical drama. To convey a broader truth about the experience, the narrative may combine multiple events into one representative sequence. The screenplay, written by Robert Rodot, also contains direct narrative echoing from battlefield anecdotes and literary sources. Rodot drew inspiration from the idea of duty versus personal ethics, the moral paradox of risking many lives to save one. This paradox appears in military history repeatedly. Think of the debates over convoying scarce transports to rescue a particular group versus using those resources for larger strategic goals. The film personifies this philosophical conflict through characters. Captain John H. Miller, the calm school teacher-turned-officer trying to lead his men, embodies the every officer torn between orders and the moral weight of his squad's safety. Contrast him with higher headquarters, where decisions are made on paper, the abstraction of casualty statistics versus the tangible losses felt at the squad level. There was also a deliberate relationship between the film's characters and archetypes from war literature. The stoic leader, the ribald private, the new recruit, these are familiar types seen in countless accounts, from Stephen Ambrose's histories to wartime memoirs. Ambrose's work, particularly Band of Brothers and Citizen Soldiers, fed a broader cultural appetite for soldiers' narratives that emphasize small unit cohesion, improvisation, and the personal dimensions of large operations. Spielberg's film taps that vein of narrative. It is less about grand strategy than about the human texture of combat. We must also address what the film omits by choice. For example, the film focuses on American infantrymen almost exclusively, with only brief contextual references to air power, naval fire support, and the wider Allied operational picture. This focus is a narrative necessity. To maintain intimacy, you must narrow the lens. Yet this narrowing can create impressions that the battlefield decisions and outcomes hinged solely on the men depicted on screen. In reality, the Normandy campaign was an enormous multi-domain operation involving tens of thousands of soldiers, hundreds of ships, and thousands of aircraft. Omaha Beach alone saw approximately 34,000 American troops land on June 6, 1944, and casualties on D-Day for the entire Allied force were in the tens of thousands. Estimates vary, but commonly cited figures are around 4,400 Allied dead. By condensing focus to a single squad, the film provides depth at the expense of that operational scale. Again, this is a storytelling trade-off rather than historical negligence.
A point often raised in discussions of the film is its emotional verisimilitude. Veterans frequently praise the opening scene's rawness, saying it captured what it felt like to be on the beach under fire. Many survivors described the sensory accuracy, the shock of sound, the way orders seemed irrelevant in the face of immediate survival, and the randomness of death. This subjective fidelity is different from factual fidelity. The film is not a documentary record of a single D-Day action. It's a dramatized attempt to convey how war feels. That approach aligns with a tradition in war cinema that prioritizes phenomenological truth, the attempt to recreate the human sensory and emotional experience over strict event-by-event chronology. Another historical element is the film's representation of the German soldier and the Wehrmacht's conduct. Here the film is selective. It portrays German soldiers as competent and dangerous, occasionally humanized through brief moments, a surrendered sniper, wounded or exhausted defenders, but largely as the impersonal antagonistic force that justifies the Americans' lethal response. This choice tracks with the film's focus. Its story springs from American officers and their internal moral debates. However, historians note that the German forces on D-Day were a heterogeneous mix: conscripts, Volksdeutsch, veteran units, and ad hoc formations, including elements of paratroopers and coastal artillery crews. Some German units were understrength or poorly coordinated, a fact that had operational effects. The film's choice to present the Germans as a formidable obstacle, at least on Omaha Beach, aligns with many reports of stiff coastal defenses in sectors where the Americans suffered severely. Finally, the film's title and its references to duty and sacrifice resonate with a broader American narrative about World War II. The war as a good war, fought to repel explicit aggression and to defeat genocidal regimes. Spielberg's film participates in this cultural framing, but it also complicates it by questioning whether the sacrifice of many for one life is sensible or even morally coherent. That ethical tension is perhaps the film's most historically interesting feature. It invites viewers to confront not just what happened, but how societies remember and justify the human costs of combat. To summarize Part 1's key points, Saving Private Ryan is anchored in real administrative policies and in specific cases like the Nylons, but it does not pretend to be a documentary. It borrows sensory details, minor incidents, and emotional tones from veterans' testimonies to achieve phenomenological truth. It compresses time and geography to construct a coherent narrative about duty, leadership, and the cost of war. The real historical inspirations give the film moral plausibility. The dramatic liberties give it narrative power. In the following sections, we move from this foundation into close technical and tactical analysis: how accurately the movie represents combat on Omaha, the weapons and vehicles depicted, and how small unit behavior compares to historical records. If there is one sequence that defines Saving Private Ryan, it is the first 25 minutes, the storming of Omaha Beach. That sequence has become so iconic that it has eclipsed many of the film's other achievements. It is often described as the most realistic battle scene ever filmed. But what does realistic actually mean here? Does the film truly replicate what happened on June 6, 1944, or does it construct a heightened version of reality designed to simulate the feeling of combat? To answer this, we must dissect not only what Spielberg shows, but also what he deliberately withholds. Omaha Beach, codenamed Omaha, was one of 5 Allied landing zones on D-Day. It stretched roughly 5 miles along the Normandy coast, between Vierville-sur-Mer and Colleyville-sur-Mer. The U.S. 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions were assigned to seize it, supported by the 2nd and 5th Ranger Battalions. Defending them were elements of the 352nd Infantry Division, a unit that had been unexpectedly reinforced prior to the invasion. The Americans faced steep bluffs, mined beaches, underwater obstacles, and interlocking fields of machine gun fire. The geography of Omaha made it the deadliest of all the 5 beaches. An exposed tidal flat funneled troops into narrow exits, while enemy positions commanded nearly every angle of approach. In the movie, Spielberg captures that geography with brutal precision. The scene opens with a shaking camera inside a landing craft, the sound muted and disoriented by the metallic thunder of waves and engines. Soldiers vomit, clutch their rifles, and await the inevitable moment when the ramp drops. When it does, hell erupts. Machine gun bullets shred the men in the front row. Bodies collapse into the water, red mixing with foam. Spielberg uses handheld camera work, desaturated color, and a high shutter speed to create a stuttering, hyper-real motion. The technique simulates the fragmented vision of soldiers under stress, sharp, chaotic, hard to process. These aesthetic choices were directly informed by veterans' testimonies. Many survivors reported auditory distortion, tunnel vision, and the surreal sensation of watching death unfold in flashes rather than in continuous motion. But let's compare this cinematic realism to the historical record. The actual first waves at Omaha, around 6:30 a.m. on June 6th, met catastrophic resistance. Of the roughly 2,400 U.S. casualties suffered there on D-Day, a large portion occurred within the first hours. Some companies, such as Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment, lost up to 90% of their men. In this respect, the film's depiction of slaughter is entirely justified by historical numbers. Veterans' accounts describe landing craft that never reached the shore, men drowned by heavy packs, and entire units scattered or annihilated before they could even fire back. Spielberg's scene condenses these hours into a single visceral burst of violence, but that condensation is emotionally truthful to the chaos that veterans described. One technical aspect the film gets right is the equipment and environment. The soldiers wear correct M1 helmets, M41 field jackets, and carry authentic M1 Garand rifles, Thompson submachine guns, and BARs, Browning automatic rifles. Spielberg insisted on practical effects rather than digital recreations wherever possible. The production imported actual World War II landing craft, built period-accurate bunkers on a reconstructed beach in Ireland, and used hundreds of extras trained by former Marines to move like 1940s soldiers. The sound design, bullets cracking past ears, the muffled underwater chaos was constructed from authentic gunfire recordings and Foley effects designed to replicate how ears process concussive trauma. When the camera follows Captain Miller crawling through the surf, momentarily deafened by a shell blast, the high-pitched ringing and muted voices replicate the temporary hearing loss soldiers frequently reported after nearby explosions. Historically, the tide, terrain, and timing are represented with impressive accuracy. The assault took place at low tide, exposing the deadly beach obstacles the Germans had planted. Hedgehogs, stakes with mines, and check hedgehogs, all accurately portrayed in the film. The men indeed had to wade through roughly 200 yards of open beach under fire. The movie shows engineers attempting to blow gaps through the obstacles, another accurate detail, as the real gap assault teams were crucial to clearing lanes for follow-on waves. Many of these engineers were killed before finishing their work, which delayed the landing schedule and increased casualties. Spielberg condenses that dynamic into quick, frantic vignettes. Soldiers carrying Bangalore torpedoes, long explosive tubes, racing to clear obstacles before being cut down. Those moments are straight from after-action reports. Yet the movie also makes choices for cinematic coherence that distort timing and structure. For instance, Captain Miller's company appears to land as a single, cohesive unit, a narrative necessity for following recognizable characters. In reality, the waves of men were jumbled. Units became intermingled within minutes. Officers were often separated from their commands. Many soldiers found themselves following whichever leader was nearby. Spielberg acknowledges this confusion visually, with soldiers shouting conflicting orders and men from different companies clustered together. But the narrative still imposes order on chaos by keeping Captain Miller's squad intact enough to remain identifiable. This slight exaggeration of organization is necessary for storytelling clarity, but departs from the full disarray described in many first-hand accounts. Let's consider the enemy side. In the film, the German positions are portrayed as fortified bunkers and pillboxes firing down with lethal precision. This is historically consistent. The German 352nd Division had spent months improving the coastal defenses,
placing machine guns and mortars and reinforced concrete emplacements and camouflaged positions. Their interlocking fields of fire swept the beaches with near-total coverage. The real Omaha beach defenses were formidable enough that naval fire support alone could not neutralize them before the landings. In the movie, this is made evident by the absence of dramatic airstrikes or heavy pre-assault bombardment, a deliberate omission mirroring reality. The pre-invasion bombing largely missed its targets because cloud cover forced bombers to release their payloads too far inland. As a result, many German defenses remained intact when the first Americans landed. Where Spielberg departs slightly from reality is in the scale of resistance and duration of the fight. The film's sequence, while feeling endless, lasts about 25 minutes. The actual struggle to secure Omaha took most of the day. It wasn't until late afternoon that the Americans managed to push inland and link up the separate beachheads. The film condenses roughly 9 hours of combat into less than half an hour, which is understandable for pacing, but necessarily simplifies the tactical evolution. In the real battle, progress came from small ad hoc groups of soldiers who found or blasted narrow exits through the bluffs and attacked pillboxes from behind. The film hints at this. Captain Miller's squad flanks and clears positions using grenades and flamethrowers, but it represents only a fraction of the overall improvisational chaos. The visceral realism of the Omaha Beach sequence also raises another question. How does cinematic depiction affect historical memory? For many modern audiences, this scene is D-Day. The handheld camera and desaturated palette became visual shorthand for authenticity. But historians warn that such visual realism can create an illusion of total accuracy. For example, Spielberg's emphasis on small arms combat minimizes the crucial role of naval gunfire support, which, in reality, saved the beachhead by pounding German positions from offshore later in the morning. The USS Texas, Arkansas, and other battleships moved dangerously close to shore to deliver point-blank fire, destroying key strongpoints. None of that appears in the film. Again, it's a trade-off. The perspective is deliberately limited to the soldiers on the sand, not the grand operational picture. After the beach, the film transitions into its central narrative, the search for Private Ryan. From a realism standpoint, this is where the film shifts from historical recreation to dramatized fiction. Yet Spielberg maintains the gritty tone established at Omaha. The squad moves through villages, fields, and ruins that echo the real hedgerow country of Normandy. The combat scenes, ambushes, sniper duels, close-quarter firefights reflect the nature of small unit combat that followed the invasion. One standout scene involves the squad assaulting a German machine gun nest defending a radar station. This skirmish captures the claustrophobic, nerve-wracking tension of close combat in the bocage, where visibility was limited and engagements often occurred at under 100 yards. The tactical behavior, flanking maneuvers, covering fire, grenades, is largely authentic. The film even depicts the psychological strain, men hesitating to execute wounded enemies, moral arguments over prisoners, and the breakdown of cohesion under stress. Historically, such moral dilemmas were indeed common. In Normandy, both sides frequently faced decisions about whether to take or execute prisoners, especially after suffering heavy casualties. While the U.S. Army's doctrine and training emphasized adherence to the Geneva Conventions, combat fatigue and vengeance sometimes overrode regulations. Spielberg's portrayal of the captured German soldier who later returns to fight again is rooted in these moral ambiguities. Some viewers criticized the scenario as improbable, but historically, similar incidents occurred. Released or escaped prisoners occasionally rejoined combat. The sequence illustrates the fog of war, the way moral clarity dissolves under pressure.
From a tactical perspective, the film also excels in portraying the randomness of survival. Characters die suddenly, often without heroic framing. This mirrors what veterans often said. Death was arbitrary. You could be hit while taking cover, or survive while charging across open ground. In that sense, Spielberg's refusal to romanticize death aligns with the authentic tone of soldiers' recollections. The film's cinematography reinforces this. Instead of wide, heroic shots, most combat is filmed close-up, chaotic, handheld. The audience never gets a god's-eye view, only the confusion of the men on the ground. However, we must note some cinematic exaggerations. Explosions are often more spectacular than realistic. In reality, mortar shells and grenades produce less flame and more debris. The film's pyrotechnics are designed for visual impact. Also, blood sprays and severed limbs, while not inaccurate, D-Day indeed produced horrific injuries, are concentrated for maximum emotional effect. Spielberg aimed to overwhelm the viewer, simulating sensory overload. That doesn't make it wrong, but it is artful manipulation rather than literal representation. The realism extends beyond visuals to behavior. Soldiers in the film display the mix of fear, humor, exhaustion, and fatalism common in real units. The dialogue, overlapping, filled with slang and gallows humor, reflects transcripts of actual GI speech patterns. Spielberg and screenwriter Robert Rodat studied wartime letters and oral histories to capture tone. The men's reactions, joking about the absurdity of their mission, arguing over orders, or quietly breaking down, align with many veterans' testimonies. Combat psychology in World War II was not about constant bravery, but about coping mechanisms, humor, cynicism, and reliance on comrades. Another key scene, the ruined village of Resemble, fictional but based on countless similar engagements, demonstrates the film's understanding of late-war urban combat. The Americans defend the bridge using improvised positions, sticky bombs, and small arms against the German armored column. While this climactic battle is fictional, its elements derive from real engagements during the Normandy and later campaigns. The use of improvised explosives, the limited anti-tank capability of infantry, and the desperate defensive tactics are all accurate. The Tiger tank's appearance is an example. Though the film used a modified Soviet T-34 made to look like a tiger, its presence symbolizes the terror these machines inspired. In reality, U.S. infantrymen did face Tigers, though rarely. Most German tanks in Normandy were Panthers or Panzer IVs. The Tiger's inclusion amplifies the threat visually and emotionally, representing the overwhelming odds the squad faces. As the battle unfolds, Spielberg doesn't romanticize victory. The bridge defense is Pyrrhic. Nearly every American dies. This mirrors many small engagements in Normandy, where tactical victories came at devastating cost. The realism lies not in literal reconstruction, but in emotional truth, exhaustion, futility, sacrifice. When Captain Miller, mortally wounded, gasps, "Earned this," to Ryan, it encapsulates the film's central moral thesis that survival demands meaning, that the living owe a debt to the dead. This sentiment resonates with the post-war ethos expressed by many veterans who struggled to justify why they lived while others didn't. It's important to highlight how veterans themselves responded to these depictions. Many who saw the film at its release in 1998 described emotional reactions so intense that theater sometimes arranged private screenings for veteran groups. Some said the opening sequence triggered memories they had buried for decades. The U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs even reported a temporary rise in counseling requests after the film's release. That psychological authenticity, the capacity to evoke real memory, may be the film's greatest historical accuracy. For a generation of men who had never seen their experiences reflected honestly, Spielberg's depiction validated their trauma. Yet historians also caution that cinematic realism can become a substitute for real understanding. By focusing so intensely on one beach, one squad, one moral dilemma, audiences may mistake emotional truth for comprehensive truth. D-Day was a logistical masterpiece involving more than 156,000 Allied troops, over 5,000 ships, and nearly 11,000 aircraft. The film shows none of that scale, but it does show what no strategic map can: the human cost of each inch gained. The gore and confusion are not gratuitous. They are historical arguments rendered in blood and sound. In conclusion, Saving Private Ryan's combat realism lies not in exact replication of events, but in faithful representation of the soldier's experience. Its Omaha Beach sequence is one of the most accurate visualizations of small unit combat ever filmed, even if it condenses and stylizes certain details.
It captures the chaos, fear, and randomness of war more convincingly than perhaps any film before it. The later combat scenes maintain this tone, grounding fiction in the feel of reality. Spielberg's achievement is to translate archival fact into sensory truth, to make modern audiences not just see D-Day, but feel it. Now that we've explored the film's depiction of battle, the next section will examine its military and technical accuracy in detail. Weapons, tactics, ranks, equipment, and whether the film truly reflects how the U.S. Army fought and operated in 1944. One of the most fascinating aspects of Saving Private Ryan is the level of technical precision applied to its portrayal of the U.S. Army in 1944. Spielberg and his team were obsessive about authenticity, employing military historians, consultants, and veterans to ensure that the uniforms, weapons, tactics, and even the way soldiers carried themselves felt believable. But beyond the visual details, the film attempts to represent how a World War II infantry squad actually fought, moved, and made decisions under fire. The result is a hybrid of strict historical accuracy and creative storytelling, a version of realism that convinces the viewer emotionally and visually, even when some elements are simplified or dramatized. Let's start with the basic structure of Captain Miller's squad. In the film, Miller leads 8 men: Sergeant Horvath, his second-in-command, Privates Reiben, Caparzo, Mellish, Wade, Jackson, and later Private Ryan. This mix of specialties mirrors a real U.S. Army rifle squad, though not perfectly. In 1944, a typical U.S. infantry squad consisted of 12 men, 1 squad leader, 1 assistant squad leader, and 10 riflemen, including a BAR gunner. The squad was often divided into 2 fire teams, each capable of independent maneuver. However, Saving Private Ryan focuses on a smaller, tighter group for narrative reasons. It gives each man an identity and allows the viewer to track personalities. The characters themselves, though fictional, represent archetypes drawn from real organizational structures: the steady sergeant, Horvath; the skeptic, Reiben; the moral compass, Wade; the religious marksman, Jackson; and the green replacement, Upham. These archetypes are historically grounded in how soldiers described their comrades, functional roles mixed with personalities. The portrayal of Captain John H. Miller, played by Tom Hanks, deserves special attention. Miller is a composite of real officers who led small units under impossible circumstances. His quiet, methodical demeanor, a civilian school teacher in peacetime, echoes countless wartime stories of citizen soldiers who transitioned from ordinary life to command under fire. His leadership style aligns with U.S. Army doctrine of the era, mission-oriented, emphasizing initiative and trust in subordinates. In 1944, American junior officers were expected to adapt rapidly and act independently when communications failed, precisely what Miller does throughout the film. When his squad loses contact with higher command, he interprets orders broadly, improvising based on the situation. That autonomy, though dramatized, reflects a real cultural difference between Allied and German forces. The German army emphasized obedience to orders, though it also valued initiative at the small unit level through its Auftragstaktik doctrine, while the American system encouraged flexible problem-solving and delegation. Spielberg subtly conveys this distinction by contrasting the improvisational Americans with the rigid German defenders.
From a tactical perspective, the film gets many small details right. When Miller's squad approaches a machine gun nest, they move using proper infantry tactics, bounding overwatch, suppression fire, and flanking maneuvers. Soldiers call out ranges, coordinate fields of fire, and communicate with hand signals, details drawn directly from 1940s training manuals and after-action reports. The soldiers use cover effectively, avoid silhouetting themselves, and employ grenades to clear fortified positions. Even their physical movements, the crouched walk, the quick dives into cover, were rehearsed with real military advisors. Dale Dye, a retired Marine captain and Vietnam veteran, trained the cast in a grueling boot camp before filming. He required them to live like World War II soldiers, sleeping outdoors,
eating military rations, and learning authentic tactics. The result is that when they move, reload, or gesture, it looks instinctive rather than choreographed. The film also demonstrates the friction between textbook tactics and battlefield reality. In the ambush of the machine gun nest, Captain Miller's decision to attack is questioned by his men. They argue that bypassing the position would save lives, a debate that mirrors real tactical dilemmas in Normandy. Official doctrine might call for aggression, but combat conditions often made such textbook assaults suicidal. Miller's choice leads to the death of Wade, the medic, illustrating the cruel calculus of command. Leaders had to balance mission objectives with the immediate welfare of their troops. This moral and tactical tension is historically accurate. Countless company-level reports from Normandy describe junior officers agonizing over whether to assault strongpoints or bypass them. Let's talk about weapons and equipment accuracy, one of the film's most lauded aspects. The M1 Garand rifle, standard issue for U.S. infantry, is faithfully portrayed. The distinctive ping of its empty clip ejecting is correctly reproduced, even though, contrary to popular myth, the sound rarely gave away a soldier's position in real combat. It was drowned out by general noise. The M1's 8-round clip, semi-automatic action, and reliability were major advantages for American troops over German counterparts, many of whom carried bolt-action Kar-98K rifles. Spielberg's use of sound, the sharp crack of the Garand, versus the deeper thud of the German MG-42, helps the audience distinguish the rhythm of battle. The MG-42's terrifying rate of fire, around 1,200 rounds per minute, is accurately represented. It sounds like tearing canvas, earning its wartime nickname Hitler's buzzsaw. In the Omaha scene, its dominance is palpable. That's exactly how veterans described facing it. Other weapons, too, are correctly depicted. The BAR, carried by Reben, provides the squad with mobile firepower. The Thompson submachine gun and M1911 pistol used by Captain Miller are authentic officer weapons. The squad's use of grenades, specifically the Mk2 pineapple fragmentation grenade, is consistent with period gear. Even small props, entrenching tools, canteens, and ammunition pouches are modeled after 1943-44 issue equipment. Spielberg's attention to such minutiae contributes to the illusion of total realism, but beyond the visual, the film gets the behavioral use of these tools right. Soldiers conserve ammunition, scavenge from fallen comrades, and adjust weapons jams under pressure. None of it feels theatrical. The Germans, too, are armed realistically. Their MG-42s, MP-40 submachine guns, and Kar-98K rifles are all historically correct. The distinctive steel helmets, camouflage smocks, and field gray uniforms represent Wehrmacht infantry, not SS, which is accurate for the 352nd Infantry Division defending Omaha. In later scenes, the Tiger tank and armored half-tracks are plausible for the period, though, as mentioned earlier, the Tiger was actually a modified Soviet T-34 prop. Still, its silhouette and presence capture the psychological reality of encountering German armor, an experience U.S. infantrymen found terrifying. Anti-tank weapons like the M1A1 bazooka are correctly shown, but also demonstrate their limitations. In the film's final battle, when the Americans use sticky bombs and improvised explosives to stop tanks, it's not Hollywood invention. U.S. soldiers really resorted to such desperate measures, especially before widespread availability of effective anti-tank rockets.
Another technical aspect, rarely noted by casual viewers, is the accuracy of radio communication and command hierarchy. When Miller's squad reports in, or when they discuss orders from HQ, their dialogue reflects authentic military phrasing. The Army's chain of command was rigid, but field conditions often forced improvisation. Radios were unreliable in the bocage terrain of Normandy, and wire communications were easily severed. The film's emphasis on face-to-face decision-making, with Miller interpreting vague orders from headquarters, reflects this communication breakdown. It's no accident that Spielberg minimizes scenes of higher command. He wants the audience to experience the isolation of the small unit, cut off from the big picture, surviving by instinct. Medical realism is another area where the film excels. The death of Wade, the squad's medic, is one of the most emotionally painful scenes, precisely because it is portrayed with technical authenticity. The men apply morphine syrettes, attempt to stop abdominal bleeding, and recite medical procedures they barely remember. The frantic, almost helpless atmosphere mirrors real medics' accounts. Battlefield medicine was improvisational and under-equipped. Morphine, sulfa powder, and bandages were often all they had. In this respect, Spielberg's depiction of the medic's role is historically faithful and emotionally devastating. The same applies to the portrayal of psychological trauma. Captain Miller's hand tremors, subtle but persistent, are a nod to what we now recognize as combat stress reaction. In 1944, it would have been labeled battle fatigue, but the symptom is accurate. Many officers concealed such signs to maintain authority. Now, a question often raised by historians: would a mission like the search for Private Ryan actually happen? The short answer: not in the way the film presents it. While the War Department might have ordered a surviving son withdrawn, it would have been processed administratively, not by sending a single squad deep into active combat zones. However, smaller rescue or liaison missions were not unheard of. Patrols were sometimes dispatched to locate specific personnel or deliver orders through enemy lines. So while the specific premise, 8 men risking their lives for one, is improbable, the mechanics of their movement and encounters are entirely plausible. The way they navigate terrain, interact with locals, and encounter scattered enemy forces matches the operational chaos of the Normandy countryside. In post-D-Day reports, American officers often complained that every field felt like a trap. The film's pacing reflects that anxiety perfectly.
It's also worth mentioning how Saving Private Ryan integrates historical soundscape into its realism. The auditory world of World War II combat, the crack of bullets, the whine of ricochets, the concussive thump of artillery, was recreated using actual period weapons recorded at firing ranges. Spielberg's sound designers studied archival footage and even consulted acoustic engineers to approximate how sound would distort through helmets and terrain. The result is a sound environment that historians have described as eerily accurate. When bullets snap overhead in the film, that's the actual supersonic crack of .30 caliber rounds. Veterans watching the film immediately recognized it. Where the film takes liberties, it often does so for clarity. The frequency of close-range engagements, for example, is heightened. In reality, not every firefight was fought at point-blank range or with visible enemies. Combat often consisted of unseen threats, indirect fire, and hours of tension punctuated by moments of chaos. Spielberg condenses that rhythm, a necessary compression for cinematic pacing. Similarly, the final battle in Rommel combines several tactical elements that would normally occur across multiple engagements: armor assaults, infantry ambushes, demolitions, and hand-to-hand combat. It's unlikely they'd all happen simultaneously in such a small area, yet each element individually is historically grounded. A smaller but notable detail is the use of German weapons by American soldiers later in the film. Historically, this was common. U.S. troops often scavenged MP-40 submachine guns, Panzerfausts, and other enemy equipment when supplies ran low or when the captured weapons offered tactical advantages. The film shows this practice subtly, another nod to battlefield realism. The depiction of death and injury is perhaps the most honest ever shown in mainstream war cinema. Soldiers die abruptly, often without heroic music or slow motion. This is consistent with historical accounts. Most deaths occurred instantly, often unseen by others. Spielberg's refusal to glamorize these moments reinforces his commitment to authenticity. The medic's reactions, anger, numbness, prayer, reflect the full spectrum of real human response. Finally, the chain of command and operational context deserve a brief look. In 1944, company-level officers like Captain Miller operated within a battalion structure that often gave vague orders: secure this bridge, hold this town. The lack of precise intelligence was normal. The film's depiction of Miller receiving only a general directive, find and extract Private Ryan, fits within that operational vagueness. What's fictional is the extent of autonomy. A captain wouldn't typically assemble a cross-unit team for an independent mission, but narratively, this structure allows exploration of leadership, moral conflict, and the breakdown of hierarchy, themes as old as war itself. In sum,
Saving Private Ryan stands out for its astonishing level of technical and behavioral accuracy. Its weapons, tactics, and unit dynamics mirror those of the U.S. Army in 1944 with remarkable fidelity. Where it diverges, it does so to condense time, heighten emotion, or explore moral themes. It's less a documentary of a single event than a composite portrait of how Americans fought and felt during World War II. By combining military precision with emotional realism, Spielberg achieves a version of truth that transcends literal history, a film that feels as real as the memories of those who were there. In the next and final part, we'll turn to the deeper cultural and ethical dimensions, what the film's story means for how Americans remember World War II, how it shapes collective memory, and whether its moral lessons align with the historical realities it depicts.
When Saving Private Ryan premiered in 1998, it didn't just impress audiences, it fundamentally changed how war itself was shown on screen. But beyond its technical genius and emotional power, there's a deeper question. How much of its legacy rests on historical truth, and how much on cinematic innovation? In this final part, we'll explore the long-term impact of the film, both on how Americans remember World War II and how Hollywood portrays it. We'll also look at the limits of accuracy, where Spielberg chose emotion over documentation, and how that decision redefined the entire genre of war movies. Before Saving Private Ryan, most war movies followed a predictable formula. Classic films like The Longest Day, 1962, and A Bridge Too Far, 1977, showed large-scale operations with polished uniforms, heroic speeches, and bloodless battles. Soldiers rarely screamed in pain. The camera cut away before the horror fully hit. The war felt distant, clean, almost noble. Spielberg shattered that illusion in the first 20 minutes of his film. The Omaha Beach sequence was unlike anything before. It wasn't just realistic, it was overwhelming. The sound mix mimicked the disorientation of combat. Bullets cracked underwater. Explosions made the screen tremble. Men screamed incoherently. Spielberg's use of handheld cameras, muted colors, and documentary-style framing pulled the audience into the chaos. Viewers could barely breathe. Veterans of D-Day said it was the first time they felt someone had captured what it was really like. One infantryman who landed on Omaha told the New York Times, "It was the first movie that ever made me cry, because that's exactly what I remember." But this realism wasn't purely visual. It came from obsessive attention to detail. Spielberg and his team researched everything, from the correct insignia on a medic's helmet to how waterlogged uniforms behaved. They studied authentic German MG-42 machine guns, recreated hedgerow terrain in Devon, England, and made actors carry 80 pounds of gear for weeks to feel what real soldiers endured. Tom Hanks reportedly said by week 2, he forgot he was on a film set. He said, "You stopped acting, you just tried to survive." This approach sparked what critics later called the realism revolution. After Saving Private Ryan, audiences demanded more authenticity from historical films. Band of Brothers 2001, co-produced by Spielberg and Tom Hanks, followed this model. So did The Pacific 2010, Black Hawk Down 2001, and even video games like Medal of Honor and Call of Duty, which based entire missions on Spielberg's D-Day visuals. The idea of cinematic realism became a benchmark, and Spielberg's film set that benchmark. Still, no film can be entirely accurate, and Spielberg knew it. While he aimed for realism in the experience of combat, he wasn't trying to make a documentary. His goal was to show what the war felt like, not necessarily how every fact happened. That's a crucial distinction. The entire mission, to save Private James Francis Ryan, was fictional. There was no real search through France to find a single paratrooper. But the concept was inspired by truth. The Nilland brothers, 4 siblings who served during World War II. When 2 were killed and 1 went missing, the surviving brother, Fritz Nilland, was sent home. The Army,
fearing another tragedy like the Sullivan brothers, 5 siblings who died together on the USS Juno, developed policies to protect sole surviving sons. Spielberg's film expanded that into myth, a story about sacrifice, duty, and moral conflict.
The characters themselves are composites. Captain Miller is not based on a single officer, but on hundreds who led small units through impossible missions. His exhaustion, his shaking hands, his quiet sense of responsibility, those are real, drawn from countless veterans' accounts. Even details like his profession as a school teacher before the war reflect a larger truth. Most officers in 1944 were civilians only 2 years earlier. They were ordinary men forced into extraordinary circumstances. Yet, there are moments where Spielberg bends history for storytelling. For example, the final battle in the fictional town of Rommel never happened. No records describe a last stand like that, with paratroopers defending a bridge against tanks. It's a symbolic creation designed to echo the broader struggle of the war. Small groups of men holding a fragile line for something greater than themselves. Likewise, the German Tiger tank in that scene wasn't a real tiger. It was a modified Soviet T-34, dressed to look like one. The U.S. Army didn't capture Tigers to use in production. There were simply none left. And yet, even these inaccuracies feel true, because Spielberg's power wasn't in literal accuracy. It was emotional authenticity. The story might be fictional, but the pain, fear, and brotherhood are not. Every historian who worked on the film agreed that, while details might differ, the experience was right. That's why veterans responded so strongly. They didn't see a Hollywood fantasy. They saw a reflection of their youth, of friends who never came home. Saving Private Ryan didn't just depict World War II. It reshaped how America remembered it. By the late 1990s, most World War II veterans were elderly. Their memories were fading, and popular culture risked reducing the war to patriotic nostalgia. Spielberg's film changed that narrative. It brought back the horror, the confusion, the moral cost. It reminded viewers that victory came at a staggering price. In doing so, it revived national conversation about sacrifice and duty. The film's final scene, Ryan standing in the Normandy cemetery asking, "Have I earned this?" struck deep. That question became emblematic of the greatest generation. It suggested that freedom demanded a moral responsibility, that surviving wasn't enough unless one lived a worthy life. Historians have noted that after Saving Private Ryan, interest in World War II history surged dramatically. Museum attendance rose dramatically. Veterans' interviews were recorded in thousands for the Library of Congress. Books like Band of Brothers and Citizen Soldiers topped bestseller lists. Even recruitment for the U.S. military saw a temporary spike among young men, inspired by the film's depiction of courage and camaraderie. However, some critics argued the film reinforced an overly American-centric view of the war. The film never shows Soviet or British contributions. It's focused entirely on the U.S. Army's experience in Western Europe. That's not historically wrong, just incomplete. But for American audiences, the story resonated precisely because it was personal. It wasn't about strategy or politics. It was about individuals. Spielberg's genius was to make history intimate, to show the war through the trembling hands of a man holding a rifle, not through maps or speeches.
Since 1998, Saving Private Ryan has become the standard by which all war films are judged. When directors attempt realism, critics inevitably compare their work to Spielberg's. 1917, Fury, Dunkirk, all owe part of their DNA to the techniques pioneered in Saving Private Ryan. The handheld camera that follows soldiers closely, the muted palette, the sound design that makes the viewer duck instinctively. But it's not just a matter of style. Spielberg redefined what audiences expect from history. Before, Accuracy was about uniforms and dates. After Saving Private Ryan, accuracy meant emotional truth. Did it feel real? Did it make you understand what those men lived through? That became the new measure. Interestingly, Spielberg's influence even extended into video games. The first Medal of Honor game, released the same year, was developed under his guidance. Its first mission? Storming Omaha Beach. Later, Call of Duty II and World at War built on that formula, mixing historical missions with cinematic storytelling. For an entire generation, their first experience of WWII came not from books, but from an immersive, Spielberg-inspired medium. Even filmmakers outside the war genre borrowed his techniques. The chaotic realism of Saving Private Ryan influenced everything from The Hurt Locker to Children of Men. In a sense, the film transcended its subject. It became a blueprint for depicting chaos, fear, and courage in any context. Yet despite its groundbreaking realism, the film still leaves open a paradox. Can any movie truly show what war is like? Even the veterans who praised Saving Private Ryan often said, "It's as close as you can get, but you'll never know unless you were there." Spielberg himself admitted this in interviews. "There's a wall you can't cross." He said, "You can make the audience feel terror, but you can't make them smell the blood or taste the sand." And that's perhaps where the film's deeper accuracy lies. It doesn't pretend to give answers. It's not propaganda, nor does it glamorize heroism. It leaves viewers with discomfort, with the understanding that war, even when justified, destroys something essential in every participant. Captain Miller's final words, "Earn this," aren't a patriotic slogan. They're a moral wound. He's not celebrating sacrifice, he's demanding that it means something. In that sense, Saving Private Ryan is both accurate and tragic. It shows that victory is never clean, and that even the good war left scars. The realism is not only in bullets and blood, but in silence, in the haunted stares of survivors, in the burden of memory. So what was real in Saving Private Ryan? The mission wasn't, the characters weren't, but the essence, the emotion, the chaos, the sacrifice was absolutely real. Spielberg didn't set out to reconstruct history. He set out to resurrect it, to make audiences feel, even briefly, what it cost to earn the world they live in. That's why decades later, Saving Private Ryan still stands as the defining portrayal of World War II in American cinema. It blurred the line between historical record and emotional truth. It gave voice to a generation fading into silence, and it set a new, impossible standard for authenticity, one where accuracy isn't measured by facts alone, but by empathy. The film's legacy is not just that it showed what D-Day looked like, but that it made millions understand what it felt like. And perhaps that's the most accurate depiction of all.